them?
We've looked at a few positive evidences for the soul. We've talked about the seemings that is universal and strong. Talked about the mereological argument, how identity stays the same over time, which points towards something non-physical. We've talked about the possibility and arguably actuality of near-death experiences. And then we just talked about free will, which is tied to the moral project and rationality. Each of these points towards the soul. Now, in your book, The Substance of Consciousness, you have other positive arguments for the soul. But for sake of time, let's start moving towards some of the other explanations for the soul and why you would critique them. And by the way, those of you watching, we're going to come together live on Friday, this Friday. Take your toughest question. So if you write question or comment, succinctly write your question in there. And I will give to JP the toughest questions that are there as long as I can understand them and as long as they're on topic. So one of the explanations, you hinted at this earlier, within a naturalistic worldview is what's called emergence. That maybe consciousness is just an epiphenomenon. I mean, H2O, when you have that, when you have hydrogen and oxygen together, you get this new property that emerges that is, say, wetness. Maybe consciousness is a similar kind of thing. Your take.
Very good. Well, the first problem is that consciousness is not, emergence is not a solution. It's just a name for the thing that needs to be solved. It's the problem. And so by appealing to emergence, all you're doing is naming the fact that consciousness at certain point shows up. But that doesn't answer why. So it's really not a solution. It's just a name for the problem. Another reason it's not a solution is because if you believe that emergence is somehow a fact about the world, then it ends up being what philosophers and scientists call a brute fact. A brute fact is a fact that has no further explanation. It just is. Why does emergence of consciousness take place at that time? It just does. That's all. It just does. There's no explanation. So it's the announcing of a fact that in principle cannot be explained by science or by anything else. So it turns out then to just be a hear ye, emergence is a fact. And that's all it is, because no evidence can in principle be given on its behalf due to its nature as a brute fact. Third, it's a case of getting something out of nothing. If you start with brute matter, which is what physicalists mean by matter, that means that matter doesn't even have the potentiality for consciousness. So the question is, how is it that you take brute matter that is fully characterized by the properties of mass and shape and size and positive and negative charge and all that, and you rearrange it in space to make it a more complicated arrangement, and all of a sudden, out of nothing, consciousness emerges? That's a case of ex nihilo. And if consciousness appeared out of nothing, then there would be no reason why a pain emerged as opposed to a thought about Abraham Lincoln, because it's a brute fact. So it would be a miracle that every time your brain was in the same state, the same conscious state showed up. There should be absolutely no correlations between the two, because there's nothing to explain it. It's just a brute happening with no further explanation. But here's another problem besides getting something from nothing, and that is a problem that the ancient Greeks called the Sorites problem, Sorites. And that worked in these cases where you have a guy with a full head of hair, and you say, if I took one strand of hair away, would he be bald? No. How about another one? No. Well, it seems like you could keep taking another hair out of his head forever and he'd never end up being bald. But we all know the difference between a bald head and a full head of hair. The problem is that there is it's hard to pinpoint a place where they go from being bald to not. Now, let's suppose that, as the emergentists believe, that consciousness emerges when the brain reaches the right level of complexity. Now, let's call that level N. N is the level the brain has to be at before consciousness emerges on the brain. N is composed of literally trillions of atoms and molecules, hundreds of billions of neurons, multitudes of cells, all in a very, very specific structure. With respect, it's not just a scattered group of neurons that are scattered on a table. They have to be put into the right structure. Now, this is on the order of trillions of things that constitute the, quote, right level of complexity. And let's add up all the subatomic particles and say there are n number of them, and that includes the precise different parts of the structure they have to be in. Okay, when n obtains, boom, consciousness. Well, what if we had one less electron? So that the structure is now, instead of 3 trillion, it's 2,999,999, blah, blah, blah. It's one less than 3 trillion. Why couldn't consciousness emerge at n minus 1? Because those are they're almost exactly identical. I mean, why one additional electron and you get consciousness, but with one less you don't? So you say, well, okay, there. Well, how about one less from that? You see where this is going.
Right.
At some point, the emergentist is going to have to say this. There is some point, I don't know where it is, but if you remove one single electron from the billions that are there, you will have consciousness disappear and there will be no consciousness at all. Now, that is making a huge effect. The presence and then the absence of consciousness itself depend on the change of an absolutely minuscule cause. The removal of one ultimate tiny particle, which would be compared to the billions that would have to still be there, because you can't have consciousness with 100,000 brain cells. So the point is that it just seems utterly arbitrary to say that, well, this is the right level and that's when things emerge. There's a better solution, and that's to say that consciousness always belongs to a soul or a mind or a self. It doesn't emerge on the brain, and though it needs the body to be functioning to some degree or other in order for the soul to work while you're in the body. Like a driver in a car, if the steering wheel doesn't work, he won't be able to get around town if he's locked in the front seat, but that doesn't prove he's the car. Same with being in the body. If it's broken down, I might not be able to do certain things like remember yesterday, but that doesn't prove on my brain.
So when we talk about emergence, you've given a few critiques of this, that you're getting something from nothing. It's what needs to be explained. It's not an explanation of how it does so. The Sorites problem. But what if we concede that you do get consciousness? It would seem that whatever emerges is dependent upon its physical base, and thus there's bottom-up causation, and you couldn't have top-down causation through thinking, through rationality and acting, which is the very thing consciousness has to explain. Is that just another level of difficulty or challenge? Okay.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because the problem of so-called top-down causation has been a horrible problem. And it really has not been solved yet, though some think they have, but they really haven't, because they change what it means by the top causing things. They fudge the word. So no, and if consciousness is epiphenomenal, that means the brain causes conscious properties and states to emerge, but then it doesn't in turn cause anything, then once again, rationality is gone by the board. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. We're having a discussion and we're presenting arguments for and against things because we think that the contents of our thoughts and beliefs could change someone's mind. It could bring about an effect. Somebody might change their position, right? Because they grasped the content and they chose, based upon the reasoning, to hold to a new view now. Why would anybody waste time giving a talk or write a book or a journal article or give a college lecture if they believed that the contents of their thoughts and assertions had no effect on anybody? What would be the point of making an utterance? So epiphenomenalism makes what we do in arguing and reasoning and lecturing pointless because it doesn't do anything.
JP, one of your critiques of emergence is that it just is turned into a brute fact. Now, I think everybody in this discussion, correct me if I'm wrong, panpsychists, naturalists, at some point have to have certain brute facts.
Yes.
I do believe in the book that you wrote with William Lane Craig, Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview, when the question of causal interaction came up, in terms of if we are body and soul, how does this immaterial and material substances interact? One explanation was that it might just be a brute fact. So why is a brute fact not okay with emergence, but then it's potentially okay when it comes to causal interaction?
That is a great question. And you do not want what are called contingent brute facts. Except in the case that they avoid a vicious infinite regress. And then you can postulate a brute fact because it saves you having to be stuck with a vicious regress. And so we postulate there's a first cause, God, who doesn't need another cause as a necessary brute fact, because if we don't, you end up with a vicious infinite regress where nothing would exist. And I can't explain that in more detail.
Sure.
But let's suppose that a situation involves a vicious infinite regress. That's the time to posit a brute fact because it avoids an embarrassing rational problem, a vicious infinite regress. Now, this interaction of soul to mind to body, suppose you say it has to happen through a physical intermediary. Well, then how does the soul interact with that physical intermediary? Well, there's got to be another intermediary that it operates. You get a vicious infinite regress. So establishing that the interaction is just a primitive brute fact and it's direct and there is no further intermediary is the best solution to avoid an infinite regress. Because we all know that I can raise my arm. And when I get stuck with a pin, I'll tell you, I feel pain. I don't know about you. But so there is causal interaction. And if you have a vicious infinite regress between mind and body, they can't get to each other. So that is when you do it. But with emergence, there is no problem of some intermediary because they just announce that it's just when matter reaches a certain level of complexity, bingo, it just emerges. And it is not postulated to avoid any kind of vicious infinite regress that has to take place between the brain and the conscious state. So these are not parallel cases. Okay. And that's what I would say. And by the way, this out of nothing problem is why David Chalmers and others are moving to panpsychism. Their consciousness emerges from little particles of matter already having consciousness. Now, at least that solves the problem of getting something out of nothing. It raises other problems, like how do you take a bunch of little conscious things and put them together into unified single consciousness? But at least it solves the ex nihilo problem, And the fact that panpsychism is on the move shows that there is a problem with naturalism. And it's got to be solved.
I want you to flesh this out a little bit, because this is going to be one of the next questions I asked. Is panpsychism is this idea that kind of soulish material is built into matter on some level. I heard Philip Goff, who's written some books on this and defended it, he said, we don't really know what matter is, and there's something mysterious about it. Maybe there's this mental element, so to speak, that's a part of it. Okay, so your first point that makes sense is this is a pushback against naturalism, that everything is purely physical in the way we've taken it to be. I want you to flesh this out a little bit, because it seems to me one of the biggest problems with panpsychism is what you referred to, not by name, the combination problem. Explain in a little bit more depth what that problem is and why it's particularly pointed for panpsychism.
Well, consciousness comes in a unity. Right now, I have a visual field, and I can see a painting. I can see your face. I can see the closet over here. And right now, I am seeing 150 different things all at once in my one single visual field. Now, it's not as though I am 150 different selves, where one self is constantly looking at that picture. Another self has the sad task of constantly looking at your face. Another is constantly looking over here at the vase. No, I am one single self that brings all of these different objects into one unified experience. We can put that by saying this. Whenever one has an experience of A, let's say a table, at the same time, one has an experience of B, the chair. So there is a what it's like to see A, and there's a what it's like to see B. There will always be a third experience called a totalizing or unifying experience, and that's what it's like to see A and B taken together. Now, the best explanation for what unifies experience is that there is a simple single self or I or ego that unifies all of these different aspects of my experience into the experience of one single subjective substance, a soul. The panpsychist has all these individual little unified consciousnesses, and somehow by bringing them together, you end up with this big single unified conscious being. And it's not clear why you wouldn't just have a crowd of individual conscious beings just herded closer together. But there would still be a multiplicity of individual conscious subjects. You can't get one from many. That's the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, it doesn't matter how close you and I get, there's still distinct individual consciousness, but there's not one that unites us. By the way, I love that you gave me a hard time a minute ago. I don't know if you remember this, but my first class of metaphysics, it was probably 2000 with you. Two of our colleagues now at Talbot, Tim Pickavance and I think Kyle Strobel was in there. And I raised my hand. I made some contribution. You said, that's really good, Sean. I appreciate that. And you paused and you said something like, it's about time you joined the class. I was wondering when you, and you just rode me, humbled me. And I thought, man, I got a long ways to go, but it was all in love, which was fun. Tim reminded me of that the other day. He goes, hey, you remember the time a couple decades ago? I was like, I remember. I was scarred. No, that's not true.
Who needs friends when you got enemies like Tim,
Exactly. That was fun. Okay, now you mentioned that there's this unity of consciousness that ties things together. Hume had what was called a phenomenological report, where he kind of said, I don't see this enduring self through time. Rather, it's just this series of experiences over time. What did Hume mean, and why do you think he's misguided there?
Well, Hume believed that the only thing that existed were little patches of sensations, like a little patch of red and a little patch of sweetness and a little patch of round. And when you put all those little sensations together, you ended up with something like an apple. So Hume said, when I enter most deeply within myself, that means when I go in within and introspect, I always confront this sensation. He called them idea, this sensation or that sensation. So a little taste of sweet, or a little taste of salt, or a sour, or a little smell of pungency, or a little patch of color, what have you. But I never come across any experience of my I or my ego. So I conclude that I have no, since it's outside my experience, I have no reason to believe in it. And I must just be a series of sensory experiences through time without any self or soul or ego sustaining and unifying them. All right, that's what he meant. Now, the problem is, how did Hume know whose stream of consciousness he was entering into? Suppose he did this in a room with 20 people, and you have 20 streams of consciousness going on at the same time in that room. You understand? If they're all awake, there are 20 flows of consciousness occurring in the room. Hume says, I entered most deeply within myself. So he thought that he was attending to the flow of, listen to this, his consciousness. But how did he know he wasn't poking around in some other person's consciousness instead of his own? You see, the way he knew that he was looking into his consciousness is because, first of all, he was aware of himself, and subsequently he was aware of the states of consciousness that belonged to him. So in order for him to recognize of these 20 streams of consciousness, which one's mine, I first have to have an experiential awareness of my substantial bearer or owner of consciousness, that is myself or I or ego or soul, call it what you want. And then I'm aware of which experiences belong to my self or soul. Now, Hume's problem was that he limited experience to the five senses. But we experience things that go far beyond that. We experience our own conscious states, for example. When I'm having a thought, I'm directly aware of what that thought is, even though I can't see, touch, taste, smell, or hear it. We are aware of the laws of logic, simple laws of logic, and we are aware of ourselves. And I think that explains the hard meta problem of consciousness. This is the reason everybody's dualists, is they're just aware of themselves. I'm sorry, but they happen to be aware of themselves. And I think Hume should have expanded experience to count as anything we're aware of, whether it's the senses, we use the senses or not. And I think that's what he meant by that, and that's the problem with his argument.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that pushback and that clarity, because there's a little line in your book that's almost so obvious, but it's important, is you said something effective. There's nothing that would convince you, dear reader, that you are not the same identical person who started reading this book.
Amen.
Maybe you had different thoughts. You maybe had different experiences. Maybe they set it down and we'll come back to it in months. But there's an ongoing I that continues through, and it's just so obvious. The other point that you make is sometimes people say, well, this idea of the I or the self is invented. And you say it's not that it's invented. Like, it's not like Hume invented this self or will at some point go, oh, I have a feeling of hot. Now I have an experience of the I. The I is the self that goes over time and has those different experiences and ties them together. It's not an independent experience. It's the one that has the experience. And I thought that was really helpful when you said, for example, like mental things are not conscience. They need a mind to kind of ground them, so to speak. Experiences need an experiencer. And I think the same thing would apply to Hume. All right, one last question for you on this, and I have kind of a personal question for you, and we'll wrap up. Some might just in turn say, JP, naturalism is simpler. Why not appeal to Occam's razor and not multiply entities beyond what is required to explain reality? You're adding all these spooky, immaterial entities. Let's keep it simple.
Well, yes. We have to remember that Occam's razor, or the epistemological problem of simplicity, which is different than the metaphysical issue of simplicity, but you're stating it. Remember, that's a tiebreaker. It is the last resort when all things are equal on both sides. And it says, if two theories do an equally good job of explaining the facts, go with the simpler than the theory and not the more complicated one. And that makes common sense, because if you're in that situation where two theories equally explain the facts, then the excess baggage that one theory has is really not doing any good, because you can do an equally good job of explaining without it. So lump it off. But what the dualist is going to insist is that all things aren't equal. This is not a tie. And you can't appeal to simplicity at the beginning of the discussion to stop the debate. You got to conclude it once you've heard all the arguments on both sides and concluded this is 50-50 equal. I'm going with the simpler, and so would I. But I maintain in our book that the arguments for substance dualism are far stronger than the arguments against it and the arguments for physicalism. And so Occam's razor never gets a chance to come on the table.
That's great. So you're all for simplicity when breaking a tie. But if you have a naturalist worldview and it can't explain free will, if it can't explain identity over time, if it can't ground rationality, if it can't explain certain phenomena that we know is a part of reality, then simplicity is not going to help you, because it's not accounting for all the facts. Once all the facts are accounted for, then let's go with the simplest explanation that does so at that point. That's really helpful. JP, here's kind of a personal question for you. You've been studying this your whole life. This book is a philosophical book with Wiley Blackwell, a leading academic publisher. What does this personally mean to you? Especially, you told me, I hope this is okay, you said you're 75. So I'm guessing as somebody gets older, they think about the afterlife more and more. You've expressed some physical challenges that you faced, even beyond any of those questions. What does this personally mean for you in your spiritual life?
Well, it means so much to me personally, because I have believed for years, decades actually, that the church was being harmed because it did not give enough attention to developing the Christian mind and learning how to know why we believe the things we do. And that was hurting us spiritually. Sean, you know me. I believe in prayer and I believe in the emotions. So I'm not just an intellectual type guy. But I still think that we've neglected that so much. And one of the things that I felt like I could do would be to kind of hold down the fort at sort of the highest levels of academic inquiry. Whereas I believe in every level. We're a team, and every level's got to be filled. I have kids in junior high; they need stuff for them. Okay, but I'm talking about my calling, and this is kind of my magnus opus, I guess you'd say. And Brandon Rickabaugh, that book would have never been done without him. He was such a great colleague. And just because you've been interviewing me, we've been sort of talking like I wrote it, but it really was the joint effort of both of us. But it is kind of my chance before I die to say that I believe I sort of I sort of dropped this little bomb out there in the other guy's territory, and it's going to keep exploding, you know. And They're going to have to deal with it. And it's going to strengthen Christians who go to grad school or who are really thoughtful Christians who like to read philosophy. And I think I've given them a gift that is maybe the culmination of a lot of what my life has been about. And so it means a lot to me to see the Lord honor this, and I'm excited to see what he might do with it. It's going to be exciting.
Friends, if you're watching this, one way you can honor JP and his lifetime effort here is to get a copy of the book, share it with a friend, share this video and this interview with others, Christians or with skeptics, to help spread the word. It's a good time to be in apologetics, JP. We have Gary Habermas making his lifetime contribution on the resurrection, Bill Craig doing a philosophical theology from his lifetime. These are very important contributions. Can't thank you enough. Now, before we sign off and come back Friday, want to make sure folks hit subscribe. We've got some other shows on all sorts of topics related to apologetics, worldview, culture, sexuality, the afterlife coming up. You will not want to miss them. And think about studying with JP and I at Bayola. I'm specifically in the Talbot Apologetics program. He's distinctly in the MA Phil Philosophy of Religion program. Both can be done completely by distance. There's information below. Check it out. As I've said many times, that MA Phil program was life-changing for me, and I hope folks will check it out. JP, I will gather up the tough questions for you, and we will be back Friday to do this live. Thanks for joining me. Really, really well done.
My privilege, my friend.